When Diane Keaton passed away, Hollywood didn't just lose an actress, it lost its quiet conscience. The woman who made imperfection beautiful, who turned awkwardness into poetry. Among the many hearts that broke that day was Goldie Hawn's. Her laughter trembled as she whispered, "I'll keep laughing for both of us," because their friendship had been more than a bond. It was a sanctuary of truth in a world built on performance. And now we invite you to walk through her journey one last time. There was a house in Highland Park, Los Angeles, where silence wasn't just golden, it was expected. Emotions weren't shared at the dinner table. They were folded and tucked away like linen napkins, as if joy or sorrow were too messy to be spoken aloud. In that house lived a girl named Diane Hall, who would one day grow up to make the whole world feel by refusing to stay quiet. Her mother, Dorothy, had once been the shining light of a pageant stage, a beauty queen with big eyes, glossy curls, and dreams as wide as the California sky. But after the applause faded, life handed her a different script: a kitchen apron, a quiet smile, and a home where beauty no longer meant ambition, only obligation. Diane watched as the woman who once lit up rooms became defined by dinner plate soap suds, and a voice used more for bedtime stories than for anything of her own. To the outside world, everything looked perfect. A neat house, a smiling family, a mother who had done everything right. But Diane saw the cracks behind the gloss. She felt the quiet weight of unspoken dreams pressing against the walls like invisible smoke. The sparkle in her mother's eyes had dimmed not from age, but from silence, the kind that kills slowly, politely. So Diane listened and watched, and quietly promised herself, "I won't disappear like that. I'll scream if I have to. I'll be loud if that's what it takes to exist." But Diane's rebellion wasn't the kind that shattered plates or slammed doors. It was gentler. It started in how she paid attention to the world. She noticed the small things, the sighs people hid, the pauses in conversation that meant more than words, the way a person's eyes could betray what their voice refused to admit. That sensitivity, that reverence for emotion, became her first instrument as an artist. She fell in love with cinema not for the glamour or fame, but because in movies people felt. They cried. They confessed. They cracked open on screen and bled truth. And in the dark theater, Diane found the language she had been missing. Not words, but presence. To be seen, to be heard. To take up space not with noise, but with meaning. At school, she was the odd one. Too intense, too dreamy. Not quite pretty in the conventional way. But that didn't matter to Diane. She wasn't chasing approval. She was chasing something much more elusive: authenticity. A life where she didn't have to pretend. A world where vulnerability wasn't weakness, but strength. And so began her quiet escape. From the world of folded napkins and scripted smiles, from a childhood where feelings were dangerous, Diane wasn't made to sit still and smile. She was made to break rules gently, to speak the truth softly and let the silence echo behind it. She didn't run away from home. She walked slowly, deliberately, with a single suitcase, a worn denim jacket, and a heart full of questions that had no answers yet. Diane left Los Angeles not because it was cruel, but because it was too familiar, too scripted, too silent. And she was ready to write something unscripted, even if it meant failing. New York didn't welcome her with open arms. It never does, ever. It greeted her with wind that bit through her coat, subway tunnels that smelled of old sweat and ambition, and sidewalks that seemed to move faster than time itself. But Diane didn't flinch. She had brought something stronger than certainty: hope. Fragile, yes, but steady. Quiet, but burning. In her suitcase, a few clothes, a second-hand typewriter, 2 crumpled scripts from acting class, and a journal filled with lines she hadn't dared speak out loud. She wasn't chasing stardom. She was chasing belonging, a place, a moment where she could exhale and not feel like she was being too much or not enough. She didn't carry her last name with her. Hall belonged to a version of herself that once believed in pleasing people. Now she needed something different. And so, almost impulsively, she chose Keaton. It wasn't just a name. It was a vow, a nod to her mother's forgotten dreams. A way to say, "What you lost, I will try to find again." There was no grand plan, just auditions and rejections, shared meals in small apartments, long nights scribbling in the margins of monologue books, and in between, a constant aching for something she couldn't yet define, to be seen, yes, but more than that, to be understood. She learned to shrink her appetite to make rent. She learned which streets had the best light in the morning. She learned the names of casting agents who would never remember hers. But none of it broke her, because inside there was a voice, not loud, not angry, just insistent. A voice that whispered, "Keep going." Diane wasn't the girl who walked into rooms demanding attention. She was the one who observed, absorbed, and then left something behind without anyone noticing until later. She carried her dream not like a torch, but like a fragile candle in cupped hands, shielding it from the wind, protecting it from the world's doubt. And in that silence, that sacred internal silence, something began to grow. Not confidence, not yet, but something deeper, a sense of self that didn't need to be loud to be real. The radiator hissed like it was angry at the world. Pipes clanked in the middle of the night like old bones arguing. The window didn't quite close, and every morning a thin line of frost traced its way along the glass, a kind of poetry no one paid attention to. That was Diane's New York. Cold, cracked, imperfect, and somehow utterly alive. Her apartment was barely more than a box with peeling paint and a second-hand futon. But it was hers, and when she lay on the floor, staring at the ceiling, stained by decades of other dreamers, she felt a strange kind of comfort, like being broke, scared, and invisible was part of the initiation. You didn't come to New York to be safe. You came to be transformed. Every morning, Diane stood in casting lines that snaked around buildings like patient snakes. She wore thrifted coats and shoes that pinched memorized monologues on the subway and tried to keep her voice steady when she walked into rooms full of people who looked past her. Every rejection felt personal. Every callback felt like a miracle. And then there were the evenings, those quiet, hungry hours when time stretched long and slow. Diane would split a sandwich into 4 pieces, 1 for now, 1 for later, and 2 for the days when later never came. Her bank account was a ghost, but her belief in art, that was the fire she kept feeding. She wasn't trying to be noble. She was just trying to live truthfully in a world that rewarded imitation. New York didn't coddle her. It stripped her. It made her honest. And somewhere in that raw honesty, the kind you find in unpaid phone bills and second-hand hope, Diane started to come into focus. She watched people. Not just actors. Everyone. The old woman feeding pigeons in Central Park. The buskers with voices like whiskey. The lonely men in cafes pretending not to be lonely. She carried them in her, their stories, their silences, and slowly they began to shape the characters she'd one day play. And still, no one clapped. No one told her she was doing great. But New York had already taught her the most important lesson. Validation means nothing if you lose your voice chasing it. So she kept showing up with frostbitten fingers, aching feet, and a heart that refused to stop believing. Because Diane didn't just want to act, she wanted to understand. And in New York, she learned that understanding came not from comfort, but from walking through discomfort without losing your tenderness. She didn't hate the cold. She thanked it, because it made her feel alive. It wasn't a glamorous audition. The room smelled like sweat and old coffee. The fluorescent lights hummed as if annoyed by the presence of too many dreams. Dozens of girls lined the hallway, legs crossed back straight. Hope cracking through forced smiles. Diane sat barefoot in the corner, arms wrapped around her knees, stomach hollow from a skipped breakfast. She wasn't trying to make a statement. She was just tired. Tired of pretending to be louder, sexier, sunnier than she felt. Tired of pushing herself into shapes that didn't fit. So when her name was called, she walked into the room just as she was raw, trembling, honest. The casting director looked up, paused, and didn't smile. That used to terrify her. Now she didn't care. She delivered her lines not like she was performing, but like she was pleading for air, for a chance to be more than invisible. There was no applause, no instant callback, just a moment of stillness and a quiet remark from the director. Don't change anything, just keep that. It was the first time Diane realized that truth didn't have to shout. That authenticity, messy, awkward, unrehearsed, could cut through a room like a storm. She wasn't performing to be liked. She was performing because if she didn't, she might disappear entirely. Acting wasn't a job. It was a way of breathing, a way to pour out all the feelings that had been sealed up inside her since childhood. Fear, longing, fury, wonder. Art for Diane wasn't decoration. It was salvation. People thought acting was about becoming someone else. For Diane, it was the opposite. It was about finding fragments of herself hidden in every character. The broken ones, the brave ones, the misunderstood ones. Especially the women who were quiet not because they had nothing to say, but because no one had ever listened. Hair was her first break. A musical bursting with energy, rebellion, and sexuality. She didn't fit the mold. She didn't try to. But she showed up barefoot, uncertain, and full of something more electric than confidence, conviction. She got the role. But she didn't celebrate with champagne. She went home, sat by her tiny window, and cried. Not because she was overwhelmed, but because for the first time someone had seen her. Not the smile, not the style, but her. The applause would come later. The magazine covers. The whispers of rising star. But none of that mattered as much as that moment in a dim room where she learned the truth: I don't need to be adored. I need to be heard. And she would never forget that. The Godfather wasn't just a movie. It was a monument, a myth, a story carved into the spine of American cinema. It had guns, shadows, loyalty, betrayal. It had Marlon Brando whispering power, and Al Pacino burning slow with quiet rage. And somewhere among those towering male titans stood a woman, not loud, not violent, not ruthless, but unforgettable. Diane Keaton wasn't meant to be the star. She wasn't the gun-wielding hero or the puppet master behind the scenes. She was Kay Adams, the girlfriend, the outsider, the woman who watched power devour the man she loved. On paper, the role was modest, but Diane transformed it into something devastating. She didn't shout. She didn't beg. She simply stood her ground, with eyes that trembled with silence, that screamed louder than any bullet. In a world where men ruled with fists and fear, Diane became the soft echo of morality they couldn't erase. She walked into that masculine empire with a dress that didn't cling and a voice that didn't tremble. And in doing so, she left a deeper mark than anyone expected. Kay wasn't just a woman in love. She was the conscience of the story. The one who saw behind the suits and smoky rooms and whispered, "This isn't love. This is control." When she closed that door on Michael in the final scene, it wasn't just a rejection, it was a revolution. A woman choosing to see things as they were, not as she wished them to be. For Diane, the role wasn't about being glamorous. It was about being real. She didn't care if people found Kay likable. She cared if they found her true. And they did. But success in that world came at a cost. Interviews focused on what she wore, not what she thought. Critics called her odd or quirky, like honesty was something foreign. In a time when women in Hollywood were polished into perfection, Diane kept showing up in baggy pants and oversized hats, not to stand out, but to stay herself. While others played the game, Diane rewrote the rules. She didn't overpower the screen. She outlived it, lingering in the minds of viewers long after the credits rolled. Because she reminded them that strength didn't always look like a gun or a glare. Sometimes it looked like a woman who refused to vanish into someone else's story. In The Godfather, she didn't just hold her own, she held a mirror to the empire. And what she reflected back was the cost of power without love. It wasn't supposed to be a revolution. It was just Diane being Diane. Annie Hall was never written to be iconic. She was quirky, neurotic, and unpolished. She wore vests and neckties and pants that swallowed her frame. She mumbled, hesitated, stammered. She didn't walk into a room and light it on fire. She wandered in, bumped into a chair, laughed at her own awkwardness, and somehow lit something deeper. That character didn't exist in the script. Diane brought her. Not just the style, but the soul. The hesitation wasn't an act, it was real. The strange cadence in her voice, the long pauses between thoughts, the look of wondering if she said too much. All of it was Diane. And suddenly, the world fell in love with the kind of woman it had never celebrated before. She didn't fit the mold. She shattered it without ever raising her voice. The critics called Annie Hall revolutionary, a new kind of female lead. But Diane knew the truth. She had just played herself. Not the version she polished for parties, but the version she was when no one was watching. Anxious, expressive, stubborn, deeply feeling. Annie wasn't a mask. She was a mirror. The clothes Diane's, the mannerisms Diane's. Even the hesitation before saying, "I love you," it was all Diane. And somehow, without trying to be anyone else, she became every woman who had ever felt too much and said too little. Then came the Oscar, and for a moment, everything froze. The lights, the applause, the camera flash, it all blurred into a surreal stillness. Diane held the statue in her hands and felt, not triumph, but confusion. Did they see me, or just the version of me they liked? Fame came fast. Praise louder than ever. Fashion editors hailed her as a style icon. Movie studios lined up at her door. Everyone wanted Diane Keaton, or at least the version they had now decided was lovable. But deep down, Diane wasn't chasing gold statues or magazine covers. She was still that girl from Highland Park, the one who grew up watching her mother fade in the kitchen, the one who promised herself she would never disappear. Annie Hall became an era, a cultural shift. But for Diane, it was simply this proof that you don't have to fake anything to be unforgettable. She wore what she wanted, said what she meant, laughed when others stayed silent, and the world didn't just accept her, it followed her. She never asked to be a symbol. But that's what happens when you live unapologetically. You give others permission to do the same. There were no cameras in those rooms, no applause, no interviews, just a woman, often in a robe. Barefoot hair a mess, sitting under the dim light of a second-hand lamp. Diane didn't need an audience to perform. Because the hardest scenes of her life were never filmed, they were lived alone. At 3 a.m., when the world slept and the city hummed like a lullaby, Diane would rewrite dialogue not because the director asked her to, but because something inside refused to settle for almost right. She'd whisper the lines over and over, pacing the floor, adjusting a single word, trying to find the soul beneath the sentence. Not for perfection, but for honesty. She believed in the invisible work, the kind no one ever thanked you for. The rewrites, the sleepless nights, the doubts, the scenes where you gave everything, and the final cut used only 5 seconds. To her, the work wasn't just a job. It was a quiet war with herself, fought in the shadows. After a hard shoot, while others clinked glasses and slipped into limousines, Diane would sit alone in her trailer. Hands trembling, heart still somewhere inside the character. She didn't talk about how much it cost her, the emotional toll, the vulnerability, the hunger to go deeper when most only skimmed the surface. She didn't need validation, but she craved integrity. And in those private, invisible moments, that's when she won. Not on stage, not on the red carpet, but in the silence that followed a single perfect take when no one clapped but Diane knew she had touched truth. The world called her fearless. But Diane knew fear intimately. She had just learned to move through it with grace, not to destroy it, but to use it as color, as weight, as texture. Every tremble in her voice, every pause in her delivery. It wasn't weakness. It was her honesty bleeding through the performance. Some nights, she sat in the bath rereading old scripts, wondering if she had said enough, if she had been brave enough, if she had honored the women she portrayed. She didn't want to be remembered for the roles. She wanted to be remembered for the depth she gave them. And so Diane kept creating in the dark, not for the world, but for the small voice in her chest that whispered, "This matters." It was in those unseen hours that she built her legacy, one whisper, one breath, one uncelebrated victory at a time. Success has a sound. To most, it's applause, camera shutters, champagne, toasts, a name whispered with reverence at cocktail parties. But to Diane, it sounded like something else, a soft, gnawing question in the dark. Was it good enough after the Oscar? After the interviews? After Annie Hall rewrote what a female lead could be? The world expected her to celebrate, to bask in the light. But Diane didn't feel illuminated. She felt exposed. The more roles she took, the more she wondered if she was just playing variations of a woman people wanted her to be. The quirky one, the soft one, the one who made silence charming. And with every praise-filled headline, another piece of her private self seemed to be claimed by the public. Behind the scenes, she wrestled with a growing fear that her best was already behind her, that every script handed to her came with the unspoken expectation, be better than last time. And if she wasn't, the world wouldn't just be disappointed, it would erase her. Late at night, Diane would drive with no destination, just her and the hum of street lamps sliding across the windshield. Los Angeles shimmered like a promise it couldn't keep. Neon signs reflected in her eyes, as if trying to remind her who she had once wanted to be. But even the lights felt hollow. Fame, she learned, doesn't rescue you. It magnifies whatever loneliness already lived inside. The same people who once overlooked her now wanted pieces of her photos, quotes, presence. But few wanted to stay long enough to ask, "How are you really?" She smiled through interviews. She showed up on red carpets. She laughed at late-night shows. But sometimes, after the cameras turned off, she sat on her bathroom floor, still in makeup, holding a glass of wine, asking the mirror what it meant to be loved when no one truly knew you. She wasn't depressed. She wasn't broken. She was just tired. Tired of being admired, but not always understood. Tired of being called fearless when inside the fear never left. But Diane didn't collapse under that weight. She adapted. She let the doubts live beside her like old roommates she'd grown accustomed to. And every time they whispered, "You're not enough," she'd whisper back, "Then I'll just keep becoming more." Because sometimes the light doesn't save you. It blinds you. It burns you. It casts shadows no one talks about. And still she walked toward it, not to be seen, but to see herself more clearly. She never heard a biological clock ticking. Diane didn't believe in that kind of noise, the kind society imposes on women as if love legacy or worth could be measured in fertility. By the time she turned 50, she had played 100 women on screen. Lovers, wives, dreamers, skeptics. But there was still a role she hadn't tried, and not because she avoided it, but because she had waited for the feeling to be right, not the timing. Motherhood didn't arrive in a hospital. It arrived in a decision, quiet, bold, and deeply personal. One day, Diane simply chose not to wait anymore. She adopted Dexter first, a small boy with searching eyes and a cautious smile. Then Duke followed, wild-hearted, full of laughter. They didn't share her genes, but they didn't need to, because from the moment she held them, something inside her, something silent for so long, cracked open and poured out like sunlight through a broken window. She wasn't trying to complete herself. She wasn't trying to save anyone. She was simply answering a whisper in her soul that said, "There's more love left in you. Give it somewhere to grow." At first, she was terrified. She had spent her whole life avoiding convention. Now she was navigating diaper changes, story time, and 2 a.m. fevers. She was reading parenting books next to film scripts, learning lullabies instead of monologues. And yet, nothing had ever felt more true. Motherhood to Diane wasn't about biology. It was about presence. It was the way her sons' voices filled the house in the morning, the way their drawings slowly took over her refrigerator, the way she caught herself smiling just watching them sleep. She taught them about art, about honesty, about being your own person in a world desperate to make you like everyone else. And in return, they taught her that love doesn't need a contract of blood, only a willingness to show up day after day with your full heart in your hands. People asked if she regretted not having children earlier. She would laugh gently and say, "They arrived when I was ready to know who they really were, and who I really was." In them, she didn't find youth. She found renewal. Diane the actress had spent years becoming different women. But Diane the mother learned how to be herself. Flawed, patient, tired, but deeply alive. Motherhood didn't save her. It didn't fix her. But it gave her something rare, a reason to slow down, to look inward, to live not for performance, but for connection. And that, for someone who had lived her life in front of cameras, was the most radical role of all. In an industry that celebrates competition more than companionship, finding a true friend is like finding stillness in the middle of a storm. And for Diane, that stillness came in the form of Goldie Hawn. Their friendship wasn't born on a red carpet or during some carefully curated Hollywood lunch. It was quieter than that, a shared look during a long shoot, a knowing smile behind the chaos, a jacket offered in silence when the wind was too cruel. They were opposites in every obvious way. Goldie sunlit, spontaneous, full of laughter like confetti. Diane introspective, slow to speak, always walking a little behind as if still listening to the world. But somehow, their differences wove together into a bond that was effortless, unbreakable, real. There was a day on set, cold rushed, one of those days where time felt cruel and the crew barked orders like war drums. Diane stood off to the side, arms folded, trying to hide how much her body was shaking. She didn't ask for help. She never did. But before she could turn to retreat into herself, a coat was wrapped around her shoulders. No words, no fuss. Just Goldie handing warmth without condition. That was their friendship. It existed outside the frame, beyond the interviews, untouched by gossip. It was in the letters sent across oceans, in the voicemails left in the middle of the night, in the silly hats worn at birthdays, the tears cried without makeup, the silences that didn't need to be filled. They celebrated each other's victories not with envy, but with joy. And when the spotlight faded, when no one was looking, they kept showing up for each other. Not because it was expected, but because love disguised as friendship doesn't need a stage. Goldie once said Diane made her feel safe to be complicated, to not always smile, to not always sparkle. And Diane, in turn, found in Goldie a place where she didn't have to explain her silences, where she could be a mess, be quiet, be heard. Together, they reminded the world and each other that women don't have to stand alone to be strong. In a town that teaches women to compete, they chose to protect. In a world that demands women age quietly, they aged loudly with laughter, with wine, with stories that were too sacred to share, but too real to forget. Their friendship wasn't perfect. It was honest, and in a lifetime spent learning how to be seen. Diane was most herself in the moments when Goldie saw her not as an icon, not as a mother, not as an actress, but simply as Diane. She didn't build it as a fortress. She built it as a place to breathe. After decades of being looked at, dissected, praised, criticized, loved, misunderstood, Diane Keaton didn't want more attention. She wanted space. And so, tucked away in the California desert under skies so wide, they made you feel small in the best way, she found her refuge. Palm Springs wasn't glamorous to her. It was sacred. The air was dry, but it carried memory. The wind wasn't loud, but it knew things. She chose a Spanish-style house with bones that spoke of our time of wear, of imperfection that had settled into beauty. The walls were white, but not sterile. They held shadows like secrets. The floors creaked, the windows opened to wild palms that danced like ghosts. It was quiet, but never empty. She called it her monastery, not out of loneliness, but out of reverence. Here, stillness was not a punishment, but a gift. There were no agents knocking, no directors asking for one more take. Only her camera, her thoughts, her memories, her mornings. Diane became a photographer, not to create something new, but to honor what already existed. A chair with no one sitting in it. A window with sunlight pouring through like forgiveness. Her own hand aged and trembling, holding a coffee mug framed in the same way she once framed characters. She took pictures of light the way some people write prayers, patiently, repeatedly, with devotion. And in that process, something shifted. The hunger to be seen was replaced by a fierce curiosity to see. Life in its quiet rituals, beauty in its flawed repetitions. The morning tea, the folded laundry, the chipped plate she refused to replace because it held too many meals, too many memories. She wrote journals in pencil, the soft kind that fades over time, like her thoughts, like her voice. She didn't fear that. She welcomed it. She no longer fought to preserve everything. She learned to let go, to trust the fleeting. After the wildfire that nearly touched her property, Diane didn't cry over the singed edges of her garden. She took her camera barefoot and walked through the ash. Every burnt leaf, every blackened petal, she captured it. Because even decay had a story. Even ruin held light. She didn't retreat from the world. She turned toward a different world, one that required no makeup, no audience, no roles. In that silence, surrounded by wind and sun and solitude, Diane was not the icon, not the mother, not the actress. She was simply a woman who had learned to witness her own life and call it holy. The day the world learned Diane Keaton was gone, the sky didn't darken. No trumpets sounded. No headlines captured the ache beneath the skin of those who truly knew her. But in Palm Springs, on a quiet balcony washed in golden light, one woman stood still, frozen between disbelief and the cruel clarity of finality. It was Goldie. The wind was gentle that morning, brushing against her cheeks like a hand trying to comfort, but failing. The desert air, usually warm and familiar, felt strange now, hollow, as if something had been peeled away from the horizon and would never return. She didn't sob. She didn't scream. Instead, she leaned against the balcony railing, arms crossed over her chest, holding herself the way Diane might have quietly, gracefully, like someone used to carrying too much without complaint. She remembered the laughter. God, there had been so much laughter. At wrap parties and dressing rooms over shared glasses of wine with no lipstick stains because neither of them cared for retouching. That raspy Diane laugh, sharp, sudden, unfiltered, the kind of laugh that made you laugh too, even when you didn't understand the joke. It had healed Goldie more times than she could count. Now, the same wind that once carried those memories back and forth between their homes now only carried silence. "I'll keep laughing for both of us," she whispered. Not to anyone, just to the air, to the sun, to the spirit of a woman who had never liked goodbyes. Because Diane wasn't the type to leave with drama. She had always preferred an Irish exit, slipping out quietly, trusting that those who loved her would feel it when she was gone. Goldie felt it. She felt it in the empty seat across from her at their favorite breakfast spot. In the text thread that would never light up again with dry wit and blurry photos of dogs in sunglasses. In the way the wind came through the palm trees but didn't carry any laughter with it. And yet she knew Diane would hate the morning. She would raise one eyebrow, tilt her head, and say something like, "Oh, come on, Golds, life's still happening. Don't let it get dusty." So Goldie didn't wear black. She didn't attend a press memorial. Instead, she took out one of Diane's old hats, the kind that looked ridiculous on anyone else, and walked barefoot across her garden. She laughed loudly into the sun, and just for a moment, it felt like Diane laughed back. The door wasn't locked. It rarely had been. Dexter turned the knob slowly, as if afraid the sound would wake her even now. Duke followed his hand, brushing the wall like he was reaching for something that had always been there. Her voice, her footsteps, her scent in the hall. But the house was still. Too still. The sunlight still filtered through the same windows. The same soft rugs still met their feet. Her glasses sat on the side table exactly where she had left them, tilted, a fingerprint on one lens. The tea in the porcelain cup had long gone cold, but the faint trace of chamomile still lingered in the air. No one called out, "What do you want for dinner?" No hand reached for their jackets. No post-it notes were stuck to mirrors with, "You're doing great," written in her careful looping script. She was gone, but the house remembered. Every wall hummed with her rituals. The piano in the corner still held her sheet music, dog-eared and smudged. The kitchen held quiet memories of burned toast and elaborate salads made only for herself. The camera, her beloved Leica, still sat facing the garden, as if waiting for that one last light. Dexter walked into her office and saw his childhood crayon drawing still taped to the inside of her cabinet door. Duke picked up an old linen shirt from the armrest and pressed it to his face, not for the scent, but for the weight of memory it carried. She hadn't left a grand farewell. No dramatic letters, no orchestrated last words. But she had prepared the silence. In her final weeks, she had folded their laundry more carefully, left old books in their favorite places, tucked photos between pages. She knew they'd come looking not for inheritance, but for proof that she had loved them to the very end. And it was everywhere, in the half-open cookie jar, in the dried lavender on the windowsill, in the warmth that lingered even though the woman was no longer there. They didn't cry loudly. They moved gently, like guests in a sacred space, because they understood now she hadn't been their mother just in life. She was their mother in every inch of this home. Even in absence, she held them. Dinner would never be called again from the kitchen, but the love that filled the air, the kind that didn't shout but settled quietly in bones, would never stop nourishing them. Most people stop. At some point, they slow down. Sit back, retire. Fold their years into albums and call it a life. Diane didn't. Even as time etched new lines on her hands and slowed her steps, she moved with the quiet persistence of someone still looking for one more frame of truth. One more shot of morning light across the hallway. One more unspoken sentence whispered through a photo. Her camera never left her side, not even on the days when her knees ached or her memory skipped. It rested near the fruit bowl on the nightstand in the passenger seat of her car. Always ready, always watching. Because Diane didn't believe in final takes. To her, life didn't stop being beautiful or worthy just because it became harder to hold. She spent her last years capturing the smallest things, not sunsets or staged portraits, but quiet rebellions of life. A crack forming in her garden wall, the blur of a hummingbird's wing, the shadow of her hat on the floor shifting through the day like a sundial. And herself. She photographed herself not out of vanity, but out of honesty. Aging wasn't something she hid. It was something she documented. She wanted to show that beauty didn't fade. It simply changed shapes, deepened, grew softer around the edges. She didn't fear wrinkles. She feared forgetting to see. Every morning she'd open the back doors, let the light pour in, and watch. Sometimes she'd take one photo, sometimes 50. Sometimes none, just staring at the way a leaf trembled in the breeze was enough. She spoke less, but she noticed more. She journaled by hand in cursive with fading ink. She wrote about the wind, about her children's laughter, echoing down the hallway long after they left, about Goldie's voicemail from last week that made her laugh out loud, about how silence had stopped being something to fight and had become a dear companion. She still dressed up even if no one was coming over. Big hats, odd shoes, mismatched earrings, not for attention, for joy. Because life to Diane Keaton was not a performance. It was an observation, a long, beautiful watch of people of light of herself aging and not disappearing. She never called cut. She never said, "I'm done." She just kept clicking, breathing, loving, recording this world before she left it. Diane Keaton never needed the world to call her an icon. She never lived for statues or headlines. What she gave us was quieter, softer, but far more lasting. She gave us permission. Permission to be unsure, to be odded, to be brilliant in our own way. She didn't fit the mold, she broke it gently, courageously, without asking for applause. In every role she played, in every word she whispered, more than spoke, she told women across generations, "You don't have to be perfect, you just have to be you." She wasn't loud, but she was clear. She wasn't flawless, but she was real. And that made all the difference. Diane didn't age for the cameras. She aged for herself, proudly, truthfully, with curiosity. Her wrinkles weren't hidden, they were photographed. Her loneliness wasn't denied. It was lived through with humor and grace. She didn't perform to be remembered. She observed life so deeply, so honestly, that we'll never forget how she made us feel not dazzled, but seen. She taught us that beauty can come from slowness, that vulnerability can be power, that not belonging is its own kind of freedom. She didn't walk ahead so we could follow. She stood beside us so we could recognize ourselves. Diane Keaton was never trying to be a legend. She just lived like someone who refused to disappear. And because of that, she became one. She wasn't a monument. She was a mirror. And in that mirror, millions of us finally saw someone who looked a little like us. Awkward, honest, brave, scared, curious, loving, alive. Now that she's gone, the light feels different, not darker, just quieter. But if you listen closely, if you still wear what makes you feel good, if you still laugh when no one's around, if you still let yourself be real when the world wants fake, then she's not gone at all. She's right there, reflecting back through you. If Diane ever gave you courage to speak when your voice shook, to laugh in your loneliness, to wear the damn hat, then carry that forward. Share her story. Leave a comment with your favorite Diane moment. And subscribe to USA Legends Never Fade, where we honor not just the fame, but the soul behind it. Because legends don't disappear, they become the light we follow.